At 9:12 a.m., in a glass-walled conference room where even silence felt audited, he said it, calmly, publicly, deliberately. "We'll reconsider your promotion in 2 years." A sentence dressed as patience, delivered like a verdict. She didn't argue, didn't defend, didn't even blink. She just nodded once, as if filing it away under something far more important than pride. Because what no one in that room understood, what they couldn't measure, quantify, or assign a KPI to, was the invisible architecture she had been holding together for years. The quiet fixes, the unlogged hours, the small decisions that prevented very expensive problems, work that never made it into reports. Because when done right, it looked like nothing happened at all. By 9:20, she was back at her desk, same posture, same calm. But something had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a precise recalibration. She stopped catching mistakes before they surfaced, stopped filling the gaps no one admitted existed, stopped being the safety net they forgot they were standing on. No announcement, no resistance, just absence, surgical, intentional, almost invisible. And for a few days, nothing seemed different. That was the illusion. By 9:27 a.m., the office had already absorbed the moment and moved on, like it always did. Calendars filled, Slack threads multiplied, coffee machines hissed like nothing had shifted. From the outside, everything remained operational, efficient, controlled. At her desk, she opened her laptop, reviewed her task list, and began working. But not like before. No more preemptive fixes. No more just-in-case adjustments. No more silent corrections that made other people look sharper than they actually were. She executed exactly what was assigned. Nothing more, nothing less. Precision without generosity. The difference was microscopic. At first, at 10:14, a minor discrepancy appeared in a shared report. Normally, she would have caught it before anyone else even noticed, adjusted the formula, corrected the data set, left no trace. This time, she saw it, and kept scrolling. At 11:03, a client-facing document went out with a subtle inconsistency in formatting and figures alignment. Not critical, not catastrophic. Just slightly off. Enough to create friction. Enough to trigger a follow-up question. She said nothing. Not out of spite. Out of alignment. The system had defined her value. She simply adjusted to it. Around noon, her manager passed by her desk, pausing just long enough to ask, "Everything on track?" "Everything assigned is completed," she replied calmly. Technically flawless, contextually incomplete. By 1:40 p.m., the team chat began to show early signs of strain. Questions that used to resolve themselves now lingered. Threads extended longer than necessary. Clarifications stacked on top of clarifications. No one connected it yet. Because nothing was broken, it just wasn't smooth. At 2:15, a junior analyst pinged her privately. "Hey, quick check. Do you usually adjust the client metrics before submission?" She glanced at the message, typed, paused, deleted, then responded, "If it's part of your assigned scope, you should follow the documented process." Which technically it was. The problem was, the documented process was incomplete. And everyone had quietly relied on her to fill in the missing pieces. By 3:30, the first meeting ran 5 minutes over. Then another. Small delays began stacking like unclosed loops in a system that used to self-correct. Still subtle, still deniable, but measurable, if you knew where to look. She leaned back slightly in her chair, watching the patterns emerge not with satisfaction, but with clarity. This wasn't sabotage. It was exposure. A system reveals itself fastest when its stabilizers step away. By 4:50, her inbox had more replies than usual. Not urgent, not alarming, just inefficient. People asking questions that felt oddly basic, confirmations that shouldn't have required confirmation. And through it all, she remained consistent, delivering exactly what was expected. Nothing more. Nothing that wasn't explicitly recognized. At 5:12 p.m., she shut down her laptop, on time, for the first time in years. No lingering tasks. No, just one more fix. No invisible labor carried into the evening like an unspoken obligation. As she walked past the conference room, she caught a glimpse of the same glass walls where the sentence had been delivered that morning. Still transparent, still polished, still missing what held everything together. And somewhere in the building, processes that once felt effortless had started to resist. Quietly, persistently, like gears running without lubrication. No alarms, no escalation, just friction. The kind that compounds, the kind that doesn't show up immediately on reports, but inevitably does. And when it does, it never looks small. Not this time. Not after what she stopped doing. On Tuesday morning, the office still looked composed. Clean dashboards, confident emails, meetings starting on time. But underneath, something had begun to drift. Not dramatically. Not enough to trigger alarms. Just enough to slow things down. At 9:06 a.m., a recurring report landed in the executive inbox. It looked correct at a glance. Numbers aligned, charts rendered, summaries concise. But buried 2 layers deep, a dependency chain hadn't been reconciled. A small mismatch. The kind she used to resolve before it ever left her screen. This time, it stayed. At 9:41, the first reply came in. Quick clarification on the Q3 variance. Can someone confirm the baseline? A simple question. Except no one could answer it immediately. Threads began forming. Replies overlapped. People referenced different versions of the same file. A 10-minute clarification stretched into 40. Still manageable. Still normal. On paper. By 10:18, a client call started with an unusual tone. Slight hesitation, extra pauses. Someone asked, "Can we double-check that figure?" Another voice jumped in, "I think that's from the previous model." Silence. Then, "Let's circle back." They didn't used to circle back. At 11:02, her manager called for a quick sync. Nothing formal, just a pulse check. "We're seeing a bit more back and forth than usual. Any idea why?" She listened, considered, then answered with the same steady precision she'd used all morning. "Work is being delivered according to scope." Again, technically correct, but the scope had always been incomplete. By noon, micro delays began stacking into something heavier. Meetings extended by 7 minutes, then 12, then 15, each one pushing the next, schedules compressing, attention fragmenting. It wasn't chaos. It was drag. At 1:27 p.m., a mid-level manager flagged a discrepancy in a performance dashboard. Not critical, but noticeable. Did this always look like this? No one had a clear answer, because it never had. Not when she was quietly standardizing everything behind the scenes. At 2:03, the operations channel lit up with a new thread. "Are we missing a validation step in the reporting workflow?" 3 people replied. 4 interpretations surfaced. No consensus. There had always been a validation step, it just never had a name. At 2:46, a client sent a follow-up email, polite but pointed. "We're seeing inconsistencies between the figures discussed and the document received. Could you clarify which version is final?" That sentence landed differently, because now it had external weight. At 3:10, her manager walked over again, less casual this time. "Can you take a look at this? Just quickly. Make sure everything aligns?" There it was. The old pattern, trying to reassert itself. She glanced at the file. She knew exactly what was off, exactly how to fix it. It would take her 4 minutes, maybe 3. Instead, she asked, "Is this within my assigned scope?" A pause, a recalibration. "Technically, no." "Then it should be addressed by the responsible owner," she replied, calm as ever. No resistance, no attitude, just structure. By 3:55, the room temperature hadn't changed, but the atmosphere had. Conversations were sharper, shorter, slightly more urgent. People weren't panicking, but they were aware. Something wasn't holding. At 4:22, finance flagged a rolling discrepancy across multiple reports. Individually insignificant, collectively not. The phrase appeared for the first time in an internal note. cumulative impact. That's when it shifted from inconvenience to signal. At 4:58, the CFO's office requested a consolidated view of productivity metrics over the past 7 days. Not unusual, routine even, but the timing was precise. 7 days. Exactly the window since the sentence had been delivered. By 5:19 p.m., the office lights dimmed slightly as people began packing up, but fewer laptops closed on time. Threads were still active, files still open, questions still unresolved. She shut down her system. On schedule. No urgency, no backlog, no invisible tasks waiting for her at home. As she stood, she noticed something new. People were starting to look, not directly at her, but around her, as if trying to locate a missing piece in a system they had never mapped. They wouldn't find it on any org chart. They wouldn't find it in any process document, because it had never been written down, only performed, and now only absent. By the time the CFO opened that report later that evening, the numbers wouldn't scream. They wouldn't need to. They would just sit there, quiet, precise, undeniable. $60 million productivity drop. No errors, no anomalies, just the cost of something that had quietly stopped happening. And in that silence, one question would finally surface. Too late to ignore. What exactly had they been relying on all this time? If you've ever been told to wait your turn while carrying more than your title admits, pause for a second. Because sometimes the most powerful move isn't proving your value louder, it's letting the system operate without it. If this moment felt familiar, you already know what comes next. Subscribe. Not for noise, for patterns. And in the next chapter, watch what happens when the numbers stop being abstract and start landing on the one desk that can't ignore them anymore. At 7:32 a.m., the building was still quiet, the kind of quiet that belongs to systems before they're tested. Cleaning crews had just finished their routes, monitors were waking from sleep, and the city outside hadn't fully decided what kind of day it would be. Inside the CFO's office, the lights were already on. He didn't rush into the report. He never did. Numbers, to him, weren't something you reacted to. They were something you interrogated. He poured coffee, sat down, and opened the file that had been flagged the evening before. 7 days. A narrow window, clean data, no noise. At first glance, everything looked normal. Revenue stable, pipeline intact, no sudden losses, no dramatic shifts, but productivity, the metric most people skimmed, had a subtle distortion. Not a drop in one area, not a spike in another. A pattern, a consistent, quiet degradation across multiple functions. He zoomed in. Operations, slight delay in cycle time, client services, increased follow-up loops, analytics, higher revision frequency, delivery, marginal but repeatable inefficiencies. Individually, nothing. Collectively, structure bending under its own weight. He didn't call anyone yet. Instead, he cross-referenced the timestamps. The drift didn't start randomly. It aligned precisely with a specific day, a specific meeting block, a specific internal calendar entry. He clicked. Executive review, Monday, 9 a.m. He leaned back slightly, not surprised, just interested. Because systems don't degrade like this without a variable changing. And this felt like a variable that had been invisible until it moved. At 8:11, he requested a breakdown, granular, role-level contribution to the affected workflows. No assumptions, just data. By 8:43, the first version arrived. It wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. He wasn't looking for perfection. He was looking for absence. And there it was. Not a missing person. She was still present in every system, logged in, delivering tasks, meeting deadlines. But the pattern around her had shifted. Tasks that used to resolve in one step now required 3. Decisions that used to finalize in minutes now stretched into hours. Errors, not obvious ones but subtle inconsistencies, were no longer intercepted upstream. He didn't know her yet, but he knew the function. The kind that never shows up in job descriptions. The kind that makes everything else look effortless. At 9:05, the executive floor started to fill. Conversations resumed. Schedules tightened. The usual rhythm returned, but now he was listening to it differently. Every delay had a tone. Every extended meeting had a reason. And every small issue had a cost. At 9:28, he joined a leadership sync. No agenda change, no dramatic entrance. He let it run. 10 minutes in, someone mentioned slight inefficiencies. Another called it temporary friction. A third suggested process clarification. He didn't interrupt. He let the language settle, because language often hides what data reveals. At 9:41, he spoke. Calm, measured, precise. Define temporary. Silence, brief but telling. Someone responded with a time frame. Another adjusted it. A third added context. None of them mentioned the pattern. None of them connected the points. He closed his laptop halfway. Over the past 7 days, he continued, we've accumulated a $60 million productivity impact. Not from failure, from friction. That word landed differently. Friction wasn't dramatic. It wasn't visible, but it was expensive. At 9:44, the room shifted. Not loudly, just enough. He didn't raise his voice, didn't assign blame. He asked one question. What changed? Answers came quickly. New process tweaks, minor staffing adjustments, a tool update, a scheduling conflict. All plausible. None sufficient. He listened, then opened the laptop again, turned it slightly, just enough for the closest executives to see the pattern overlay. A clean graph, no spikes, no anomalies, just a downward slope that began at exactly 9 a.m. the previous Monday. Same moment, same meeting, same sentence. He didn't say it. He didn't need to. By 9:48, someone finally asked, carefully, is this tied to a specific role? He didn't answer immediately. He zoomed in further, layering task completion against correction frequency, against communication loops, against revision cycles. Then he stopped. There it was again, not a gap, a withdrawal, measured, consistent, intentional. At 9:52, he gave the only instruction that mattered. Identify the function that used to eliminate these steps. Not the title, not the department, the function. Because titles can be replaced. Functions are harder. By 10:06, the meeting ended without a formal conclusion. No decisions announced, no action plan distributed, just a quiet urgency that followed people out of the room like an unfinished equation. Back at her desk, she opened her inbox. 3 new emails, 2 meeting invites, 1 flagged thread, nothing unusual, except the tone, subtly different, slightly sharper, a little more attentive. She read them, responded where required, ignored what wasn't within scope. Same precision, same boundaries. At 11:17, her manager stopped by again. Not casual this time, not rushed either. Measured. We might need your help reviewing a few cross-functional items, he said. She looked up, not defensive, not surprised. Happy to support within my role, she replied. A small sentence, but now it carried weight, because for the first time they were trying to define the role, not assume it. By noon, the internal threads had a different energy, fewer assumptions, more questions. People weren't just solving issues anymore, they were trying to understand why those issues existed in the first place. It was slower, but it was honest. At 1:38 p.m., Finance sent a follow-up request, more detailed, more focused. The CFO wanted correlation, not just confirmation, not what happened, but what stopped happening. And somewhere between those two questions, the answer was already forming. It just hadn't been said out loud yet, not by them, not by her, but soon it would have to be. Because systems can ignore noise. They can even absorb errors, but they cannot ignore cost. Not when it's this precise, not when it's this quiet, not when it points to something that was never officially there, yet always essential, and now impossible to overlook. By 2:06 p.m., the office had stopped pretending it was just a busy week. Not because anything had broken, nothing had. Every system still ran. Every report still generated. Every meeting still happened. But the effort behind all of it had doubled. At 2:14, a cross-functional call that usually took 12 minutes stretched past 30. Not due to complexity, due to alignment. People weren't disagreeing. They were recalculating, verifying, asking questions that used to feel unnecessary. At 2:31, her manager rescheduled his third meeting of the day. At 2:37, a second team did the same. Small shifts, but synchronized. By 2:42, the CFO's request came through again, this time not as a question, but as a directive. Map the missing function. Not the person, the function. That wording traveled fast, because everyone understood what it implied. Something critical had existed without ever being formally defined. And now, they had to reverse engineer it under pressure. At 3:05, a working session was called, mid-level leads, ops, analytics, delivery. No executives in the room, just the people who actually touched the processes. A whiteboard filled quickly. Data validation? Pre-submission checks? Client expectation alignment? Internal QA loop? They wrote it all down, then circled half of it, because none of those fully explained the pattern. At 3:18, someone said it quietly. It wasn't a step. It was a layer. The room went still for a second, because that felt closer. A layer doesn't show up in process diagrams. It isn't assigned. It isn't tracked. It just exists until it doesn't. At 3:27, they began reconstructing recent workflows, before and after. Same inputs, same tools, same people, different outcome. Not worse, just heavier. More effort for the same result. At 3:42, one of the analysts pulled up message logs. "Look at this," he said. "We're asking 2.6 times more clarification questions per task." Another added, "Revision cycles are up 1.8 times." A third, "Client follow-ups increased 22%. No single number was alarming. Together, they told a very specific story, not failure, friction. At 4:03, her manager joined the room. He didn't take over, just listened, watched the board, the notes, the patterns forming without being forced. At 4:11, someone finally connected it, not as a statement but as a question. Who used to catch this before it reached us? Silence. Not because they didn't know, because they did. They just hadn't said it out loud. At 4:19, the manager exhaled slowly, not frustrated, not surprised, just aware. "She did," someone said. No name needed. At 4:22, the room didn't react. No dramatic realization, no sudden urgency, just a quiet recalibration, because now the problem wasn't abstract anymore. It had shape, and more importantly, it had absence. At 4:30, they pulled her workload history, official tasks, standard, reasonable, within role. Unofficial patterns, everything else, dozens of micro-interventions per day, silent corrections, preemptive alignments, unlogged decisions that removed entire chains of downstream effort, not once requested, not once documented, always delivered, until 7 days ago. At 4:44, the CFO joined remotely. No introduction, no context. He looked at the board, at the data, at the reconstructed workflows, then asked one question: "Can any of you absorb this function without increasing headcount or cost?" No one answered, because the data already had $60 million. That wasn't a salary problem, that was a structural dependency. At 4:49, he nodded slightly. Not approval, not disapproval, recognition. "Then we're not discussing performance," he said. "We're discussing misclassification." The word landed with precision. Misclassification, not undervaluation, not oversight. A system labeling something incorrectly and paying for it. At 4:53, he continued, "Fix the classification or the cost compounds." No threat, no urgency in tone, just math. He disconnected. The room stayed quiet for a few seconds after the call ended, not because they didn't know what to do, because now they understood what it would cost not to. At 5:07, her manager returned to his desk and opened her profile. Title: accurate. Responsibilities: incomplete. Impact: unmeasured, until now. At 5:12, he started drafting a message, deleted it, started again, because the usual language didn't apply. Can you help? Sounded insufficient. Let's revisit your role sounded late. Let's talk? Sounded vague. At 5:19, he stopped typing, because for the first time the system wasn't ahead of her, it was catching up. Across the office, people were still working, still resolving, still clarifying, still compensating for something they hadn't fully understood a week ago. And at her desk, she closed her laptop. On time. Again. No backlog. No invisible queue waiting to be processed later. Just a clean stop. The kind she had quietly enabled for everyone else, for years. As she stood up, her phone vibrated. One new message. From her manager. Short. Carefully worded. Different. She looked at the preview. Didn't open it immediately. Because for the first time, the system was speaking to her in a language it hadn't used before. Recognition. Not assumed, not borrowed, earned through absence. And whatever came next wouldn't be about catching mistakes. It would be about defining value, properly, finally. At 7:58 a.m., the message was still unread. Not out of hesitation, not out of strategy, just timing. She placed her bag down, turned on her monitor, and let the system come online the way it always did. Quietly, predictably, without asking for attention. Then she opened it. Short, precise, unusual in its tone. Can we talk today? I'd like to better understand your role and how we can align it with current needs. No urgency markers, no assumptions, but also no shortcuts. She read it once, then again, because this wasn't a request for help. It was a request for definition. At 8:11, she replied, available at 11:30. No elaboration, no signal beyond clarity. At 8:27, the office began to fill. Conversations resumed, screens lit up, threads restarted where they had left off the night before. But something subtle had changed. People weren't just moving faster. They were moving carefully, checking twice, confirming once more, building in buffers where none had existed before. It looked like discipline. It felt like cost. At 9:03, another report circulated. Cleaner this time, more deliberate, still slower. At 9:19, a meeting started with a new line. Let's make sure we're aligned before we proceed. They used to proceed and align along the way. Now, alignment came first, because misalignment had become expensive. At 10:07, the CFO received an updated breakdown. Same 7-day window, same functions, but this time with attribution attempts. Not perfect, not complete. But directionally clear. The missing function had a center, and that center had a name. He didn't act immediately. He never did. Because reaction fixes symptoms. Definition fixes structure. At 11:28, she walked into the meeting room 2 minutes early. Glass walls again? Same room? Different purpose. At 11:30, her manager entered, followed by a brief pause, as if he was choosing the right version of himself for this conversation. He didn't sit immediately. Thanks for making time, he said. Of course, she replied. Neutral. Open. Unmoved. He sat down, folded his hands. Not defensive, not casual. Intentional. I want to understand something, he began. Over the past week, we've seen changes, not in output, but in how work flows through the team. She nodded slightly, listening, not filling. He continued, there's a layer of work that doesn't seem to be captured anywhere, but it's clearly affecting outcomes, and it looks like you are handling a lot of it. A careful sentence, not an accusation, not yet recognition, just observation. She let a second pass, then answered, I've been working within my assigned scope. True, complete, and deliberately narrow. He exhaled, not frustrated, but recalibrating. I think the assigned scope might not reflect the actual function, he said. There it was, the first real shift in language. Function, not tasks, not responsibilities, something deeper. She met his vzglad, steady, precise. What would you like to clarify? She asked. No resistance, no volunteering, just structure. At 11:37, he opened his laptop, turned it slightly toward her. Not to prove anything, to align. This is what we're seeing, he said. Graphs, patterns, increases in revision loops, clarification chains, time delays, and one clean overlay. A drop that began exactly when something stopped happening. She looked at it, recognized every line, not emotionally, technically. At 11:42, he asked the question that mattered. Were you intentionally handling these steps before they reached the team? She paused. Not for effect, for accuracy. Yes, she said. No justification, no explanation, just confirmation. The room didn't shift dramatically, it stabilized, because now the variable had a name. At 11:44, he leaned back slightly. Why wasn't this documented, he asked. A fair question, a late one. She answered without hesitation, because it wasn't requested. Silence, not uncomfortable, just precise. At 11:46, something clicked, not as a realization, but as acceptance. They hadn't lost performance, they had lost an undocumented system. At 11:48, he closed the laptop. We need to redefine your role, he said. Not expand, not adjust, redefine. Because what existed before didn't fit into the current structure, and forcing it back would just repeat the cycle. She nodded once, acknowledging the direction, not committing to it. At 11:50, he added, This isn't about asking you to do more. It's about making sure what you do is visible, measurable, and properly accounted for. Closer, but still not complete, because visibility without alignment is just observation. At 11:52, she spoke, calm, controlled. Clarity works both ways. He held her gaze, understanding. Finally. At 11:55, they didn't finalize anything. No numbers discussed, no titles proposed, because those come after definition, not before. At 12:03, she left the room. Same pace, same posture. But now, the system wasn't operating around her. It was orienting toward her. At 12:17, the CFO received a short update. Function identified, role misclassified, alignment in progress. He read it once, closed the message. No reply. Because the next step wasn't approval, it was structure. And structure takes one thing the system had avoided until now: acknowledgement. Not just that she mattered, but how, precisely, measurably, and permanently. By 2:08 p.m., the conversation had already spread, quietly, efficiently, without announcement, not through emails, through tone. Meetings ran differently. Questions were sharper. People weren't just trying to solve issues anymore. They were trying to understand where those issues should never have existed in the first place. At 2:21, HR received a calendar block from her manager. Role alignment, draft review. 30 minutes, no attachments. But the title alone carried more weight than most full decks. At 2:34, finance updated the internal tracker. The $60 million figure remained, not revised, not softened, just contextualized, attributed to process friction following functional gap. The language had matured, so had the problem. At 2:47, the CFO requested one additional input: model cost of reinstating function versus distributing it. Not emotional, comparative. Because now it wasn't about her, it was about architecture. At 3:02, the first draft of her role redefinition appeared. Not a promotion document, not yet. A structural map. Key functions outlined. Decision points identified. Intervention layers formalized. They gave it a name: Preemptive Operations Control. Not perfect, but closer than anything before. At 3:11, her manager reviewed it, then edited, removed vague language, replaced support with owns, replaced assists with governs, replaced as needed with by design, because ambiguity had already proven expensive. At 3:26, HR pushed back, lightly, predictably. This scope overlaps multiple roles. Of course it did, because the function itself connected those roles. That was the point. At 3:34, the manager responded, "The overlap is the function." Short, clear, difficult to argue with. At 3:41, the CFO added a single comment: quantify impact retention. Translation: if this role exists, what cost disappears? Not what effort increases, what loss is prevented. At 3:55, finance began modeling scenarios. Version A: distribute tasks across teams. Version B: formalize single ownership. Version A looked efficient on paper. Version B looked expensive until you accounted for friction. At 4:12, the numbers stabilized. Version A: partial recovery, residual inefficiency. Version B: near total restoration of baseline flow. No surprise, just confirmation. At 4:18, the CFO closed the model. Decision made, not announced. He didn't need consensus, he needed coherence. At 4:26, her manager walked over to her desk. No laptop this time, no charts, just intent. "Do you have a few minutes?" he asked. She looked up, measured the tone. "Yes." They stepped into a smaller room, no glass walls this time, less performative, more direct. At 4:29, he placed a single printed page on the table. No branding, no formatting polish, just structure. "I want you to look at this, not as an offer," he said, "but as a definition. Important distinction. Because offers negotiate, definitions anchor." She read it, line by line, not scanning, analyzing. At 4:33, she reached the core section. Ownership of cross-functional validation layers. Authority to intercept and correct pre-delivery outputs. Accountability for workflow efficiency metrics, not tasks. Control points. At 4:35, she set the page down, looked at him. "This reflects the function," she said. "Not approval, validation." At 4:36, he nodded. "Now we need to align it with everything else." Everything else. Compensation, title, scope boundaries, reporting line, the visible parts. At 4:38, she asked the only question that mattered: what changes operationally, starting tomorrow? Direct? Immediate? Because definition without execution is just documentation. He didn't hesitate. "You operate at this level, officially. No transition period, no phased rollout. Because the function had already been proven. At 4:40, she considered it. Not emotionally, systemically. Then nodded once. "Then the system adjusts with it," she said. Simple, but precise. At 4:42, he allowed himself a small pause. Relief, not from pressure, but from clarity. "Thank you," he said. She didn't respond immediately. Because this wasn't about gratitude, it was about alignment. At 4:44, she added, "Clarity reduces cost." A statement, not a reminder. At 4:46, they left the room, back into the office that now felt different, not calmer, more accurate. At 5:03, the first real test appeared, a cross-team deliverable with tight timing and multiple dependencies. Before, it would have moved, eventually. Now she stepped in, not loudly, not visibly, just at the right points, adjusted one sequence, corrected one assumption, aligned two teams before they diverged. 5 minutes of intervention, 3 hours of potential delay, gone. No one applauded. No one needed to, because the system felt it instantly. Smooth again. At 5:19, she closed her laptop. On time? Again. But this time, not because she had stepped back, because the system had finally caught up to what she actually was, not extra effort, not hidden support, a defined function, measured, recognized, integrated, and somewhere in the building, the same processes that had resisted for 7 days began to flow again, not perfectly, but predictably. which in systems like this is everything. No announcement, no celebration, just the quiet return of something that had never been optional, only invisible, until it wasn't. End.